What if the silence is not the end of your story, but the part where everything finally becomes real? What if the distance is not proof that you were forgotten, but proof that your absence is starting to be felt in ways that words never could explain? Stay with me, because this matters. Sometimes people do not wake up when love is close. They wake up when it is gone. They do not understand your value while your energy is still in the room, while your voice is still easy to reach, while your care still feels normal. They understand it when the room changes, when the pattern breaks, when the message does not come, when the warmth they got used to is no longer there. And that is when something deeper begins, not on the surface, not in public, not with loud confession. It begins in the hidden part of the mind, where memory gets louder, where resistance gets tired, where truth keeps tapping until it can no longer be ignored. So if you think silence means nothing is happening, think again. Some of the biggest emotional shifts happen in total silence. Some of the strongest realizations arrive when there is no more distraction left. And sometimes the person who stepped back is not moving on at all. Sometimes they are entering the exact inner conflict that makes the next step unavoidable. Listen closely, because what comes next may explain more than you expected, and it may show you why people often return only after distance forces them to meet the truth they were trying so hard not to feel. When someone is emotionally attached but cannot fully face that attachment, the mind starts protecting itself in strange ways. It does not always say, "I miss this person." It does not always admit, "I am scared to lose them." Instead, it pushes those feelings sideways. It turns them into mixed signals: cold behavior, silence, delay, pride, confusion. On the outside, the person may look distant. On the inside, they may be more emotionally active than ever. That is what makes human attachment so difficult to read. What you see is not always what is happening. A person can pull away while thinking more. They can act calm while replaying everything. They can look fine while their mind keeps circling back to your voice, your presence, your energy, the way things felt when you were still there. The mind struggles when it has to hold two truths at the same time. One truth says, stay independent, stay guarded, do not need anyone. The other truth says, this connection mattered more than you wanted to admit. That tension creates pressure, and to escape that pressure, people often act in ways that do not match what they feel. They minimize, they rationalize, they pretend, but deep inside the emotional system is still working, still comparing, still measuring the difference between presence and absence, still returning to memories that used to feel ordinary and now feel heavy with meaning. Watch this carefully, because behavior can lie for a while, but emotional truth keeps moving underneath it, and when it gathers enough force, it starts pushing everything toward recognition. Absence changes perception in a way presence never can. When someone is always there, the mind gets comfortable. It adapts, it relaxes, it starts assuming that the connection will remain. What feels secure often fades into the background, not because it lacks value, but because it feels stable, and the mind does not always study what it believes it can keep. But the moment that presence is reduced, something sharp happens inside. The nervous system notices the gap. The routine breaks. The emotional field changes. Suddenly, what was once normal becomes visible. What was once easy becomes important. What was once taken for granted becomes impossible to ignore. This is why absence can feel louder than presence. It creates contrast, and contrast wakes the mind up. It forces comparison. It makes people replay old moments and hear them differently. It makes them remember the little things, the tone, the timing, the comfort, the details they never thought twice about while everything was still close. Stay with this part, because it explains so much. People do not always know how much someone means until they feel the space where that person used to be. And once that space becomes real, the mind starts trying to fill it. It asks questions. It imagines outcomes. It reopens old emotional doors. In that way, absence does not kill connection. Very often, it deepens the inner experience of it. It brings the bond inward. It makes the emotional system work harder, think longer, and search for relief from the tension that silence creates. The ego plays a bigger role in all of this than most people realize. The ego is not just pride. It is the part of the mind that wants control, order, stability, and protection from emotional exposure. When a meaningful bond starts slipping away, the ego does not simply feel sad. It feels threatened. It feels the loss of control. It feels the breaking of an inner structure it thought was secure, and that is why it resists. It resists through excuses, through emotional shutdown, through indifference that is often more performance than truth. A person may tell themselves they do not care. They may act as if nothing changed. They may push away the whole situation because facing it directly would mean admitting vulnerability. But while the ego is trying to stay strong, the emotional system is still reacting. That creates friction inside. One side says, protect yourself. The other side says, this mattered. One side says, stay silent. The other side says, something is unfinished here. That inner clash becomes exhausting, and the longer it continues, the harder it is to maintain the false calm. This is why resistance often comes before re-engagement. Not because the person is clear, but because they are torn. The ego tries to avoid pain by rejecting the truth, yet the truth stays active. It keeps showing up in memory, in restlessness, in regret, in sudden emotion that seems to come out of nowhere. And slowly, the same person who acted detached may begin to question their own distance, not because they planned to, but because holding the denial becomes heavier than facing the feeling. There is another force that keeps the emotional loop alive, and it is one of the strongest forces in human connection: inconsistency. When someone receives warmth and distance in uneven cycles, attention and silence in unpredictable waves, the mind does not settle. It stays alert. It keeps waiting. It keeps searching for the next signal. This is why unstable emotional patterns can create such powerful attachment. The issue is not always intensity. Often it is uncertainty. The brain becomes focused on the possibility of connection, not just the connection itself. A brief moment of closeness can feel bigger than long periods of calm because it arrives inside unpredictability. It lands harder. It creates hope. It leaves questions. It prevents closure. And when closure is missing, the mind keeps the story open. It replays. It scans. It wonders what comes next. That unfinished feeling can hold a person in place far longer than logic would approve. Even when they tell themselves to move on, the nervous system may still be waiting for resolution. This matters because many people mistake inconsistency for loss, when in reality, inconsistency often keeps emotional attention alive. The person may step back, but the pattern still owns space in their mind. The silence may look final, but internally they may still be reading it as part of an unfinished sequence. That is why some people return after distance. Not because the story was simple, because the uncertainty never truly ended inside them, and until clarity replaces unpredictability, the connection can remain active in the background, pressing for completion, pressing for contact, pressing for some kind of answer that lets the emotional system finally rest. Then regret begins to form, and regret is rarely sudden. It builds quietly. It grows in the hidden corner of the mind, where truth waits for the ego to get tired. At first, the person may justify everything. They may explain away the distance. They may tell themselves the connection was not that deep, not that rare, not that meaningful. But emotional truth does not follow excuses forever. It starts collecting evidence. A memory here, a moment there, a feeling they did not respect enough at the time, the support they thought would always be there, the calm they only notice after it disappears. Regret is not just missing someone. It is realizing too late what their presence was doing for your life. It is understanding after the fact. It is emotional clarity arriving behind schedule, and that is why regret can hit so hard. It does not just replay events, it changes their meaning. A moment that once felt small now feels important. A conversation that seemed ordinary now feels loaded. A person who seemed easy to reach now feels deeply significant because their absence has turned memory into contrast. This is where the hidden self starts speaking louder. Pride says, do not admit it. Truth says, you already know. Pride says, stay distant. Truth says, you feel the loss. And when those two forces collide long enough, the person begins to shift from defense to recognition. They may not announce it. They may not even understand it fully. But inside, the weight is building. And once regret becomes strong enough, it stops being passive pain and starts becoming movement. The kind of movement that pushes someone to reconsider what they once dismissed too quickly. A powerful truth in relationships is that attachment often happens before awareness. People bond before they fully understand that they have bonded. They grow used to someone before they understand that the person has become emotionally important. This happens because the mind normalizes what is steady. If a connection feels natural, if the presence is regular, if the care is consistent, it can blend into daily life. It becomes part of the emotional environment, Not ignored, but unexamined. The heart adjusts before the mind names what is happening. And then one day the pattern breaks. The distance appears, the energy shifts, and awareness rushes in. Suddenly the person sees what had already been forming for a long time. They understand the value after interruption. They understand the bond after separation. They understand the need after the loss of comfort. This delay between attachment and awareness explains so much confusion after distance. People say, "I do not know why I feel this now." But the feeling did not start now. The awareness started now. The bond was already there. The mind just had not fully turned toward it. And when it finally does, the emotional impact can be intense. Because realization often arrives all at once, even though attachment was built slowly. Keep listening, because this is where many people misread the story. They think the other person stopped caring. In reality, sometimes the other person has only now begun to understand what they were already emotionally tied to. Awareness has caught up. And when awareness catches up with attachment, longing often follows, then reflection, then the deep and difficult question that silence cannot keep buried forever. What did this connection truly mean, and what happens if I let it disappear? While no words are being spoken, a hidden negotiation begins. It happens under the surface, behind the face, below the normal stream of thought. One side of the mind holds memory, attachment, familiarity, the comfort of what once felt safe and known. The other side holds pride, fear, self-protection, and the need to avoid rejection or emotional risk. These sides do not settle things quickly. They argue in silence. They test each other. They reopen scenes. They imagine what could happen next. This is why silence is never always empty. Sometimes it is full of internal movement, full of emotional recalculation, full of a struggle the other person may not even know how to explain. They may not be consciously planning a return, but something inside them is trying to restore balance. They revisit old conversations. They rethink their own choices. They ask themselves questions in indirect ways. What was real? What did I feel? Why does this still stay in my mind? Why does distance not feel like peace? This is not just logic. It is emotional processing, trying to resolve what the ego left unfinished. And eventually, one side begins to gain ground. If fear stays stronger, the silence may continue. But if attachment grows heavier than resistance, movement starts. Maybe small at first, maybe subtle. A check-in, a glance, a message, a shift in energy. But make no mistake, that movement does not come from nowhere. It comes from everything the mind has been carrying in silence. So if the outside looks still, do not assume the inside is quiet. Some of the deepest decisions are made in the unseen space where memory and resistance fight for control. Separation does something else that is often painful, but deeply important. It forces a person to face themselves without the emotional mirror they were relying on. When a strong connection exists, people often place parts of themselves into that bond without even noticing. Their calm may depend on it. Their identity may lean on it. Their sense of emotional orientation may be shaped by it. The relationship becomes more than contact. It becomes structure. And when separation removes that structure, the person can feel unsteady, exposed, disoriented. At first, this feels like pure loss, but it is also revelation. Because once the external support is gone, the mind has to turn inward. It has to ask what was truly mine and what I was borrowing from that connection, which feelings were rooted in me and which were being regulated by the other person's presence. That process is uncomfortable. It can feel lonely. It can feel sharp, but it also creates clarity. It shows where dependency was hiding. It shows where projection was active. It shows where emotional truth had been spread across the bond instead of fully owned within the self. This is why separation can trigger such deep change, not just because someone is gone, but because the self is now forced into direct contact with what used to be softened by closeness. And in that contact, people often realize two things at once: how much the connection mattered and how much inner work they avoided while the connection was still there. That mix of realization and exposure can become a turning point, one that leads either toward deeper maturity or back toward the person whose absence made the truth impossible to escape. Now here is where the story turns sharper. Many people think the next step happens because someone suddenly becomes romantic, dramatic, or overwhelmed by a burst of emotion. But very often, the next step is born in something quieter and stronger than that. It is born in repetition, in the same memory returning too many times. in the same emptiness showing up at the wrong hour, in the same internal question refusing to leave. The mind can only ignore a truth for so long before that truth starts shaping behavior. It slips into dreams. It enters comparison. It appears in moments of stillness. The person notices that other conversations feel flat. Other attention feels thin. Other connections do not reach the same place. And then a thought starts growing. Maybe I misread what I had. Maybe I stepped away too fast. Maybe that silence did not erase the bond. Maybe it exposed it. This is where reconsideration begins, not with a dramatic speech, but with a change in inner weight. The person starts feeling the cost of their own distance. They start seeing their withdrawal from the other side. They imagine what it looked like, what it felt like, what it may have damaged. And this matters because empathy can wake up where denial once ruled. The emotional system begins to soften. Pride loosens. Defenses become harder to maintain. And once that shift happens, even slowly, silence is no longer neutral. It becomes pressure. It becomes a door waiting to be opened. So keep watching this part of the story, because the moment before contact is often not loud. It is internal. It is the quiet second when avoidance stops feeling safer than truth. There is also a cruel but revealing fact about emotional distance. The mind often recognizes value through deprivation. What was easy becomes rare. What was normal becomes precious. What was always available becomes the very thing the heart starts searching for when it can no longer reach it. This is not because people are heartless. It is because human perception wakes up through contrast. We feel the shape of something when it is no longer filling the space it used to fill. That is why silence can become a teacher. It shows what presence was doing. It shows how much comfort, energy, identity, rhythm, and emotional grounding had quietly entered the person's life through a connection they may have underestimated. And once that understanding begins, it can spread fast. They remember how they felt around you. They remember the strange safety, the mental ease, the emotional spark, the way their own inner world shifted in your presence. Those details start standing out against the emptiness of distance, and that emptiness does not simply stay empty. The mind fills it with thought, with images, with emotional replay, with the voice of recognition growing stronger day by day. If you are still here, listen carefully, because this is where many stories truly change, not when someone is still deciding whether they care, but when they can no longer deny that they do. And once denial gets too heavy, movement becomes likely, not guaranteed in every story, but deeply possible in any story where the bond was real enough to leave a mark that distance could not erase. Still, the return is not always about going backward. That is important. When someone finally feels the truth of what they lost, they are not being pulled only toward the past. They are being pulled toward unresolved meaning. They are being pulled toward the part of the story that did not finish inside them. That is why the next step can feel so powerful. It is not just contact. It is an attempt at resolution, an effort to reduce the emotional pressure that silence created, a reaching toward understanding. Sometimes it is a message that sounds simple, but carries months of inner conflict behind it. Sometimes it is an apology. Sometimes it is curiosity. Sometimes it is just one small opening after a long internal war. But that opening matters, because it usually means the resistance has weakened enough for truth to move, and truth always moves differently than ego. Ego wants control. Truth wants honesty. Ego wants safety. Truth wants relief. Ego wants to appear untouched. Truth wants the burden to stop. So when a person takes that next step, it often comes after a long period where they tried not to. That is why it can feel delayed but sincere. The mind had to travel through contrast, loss, regret, uncertainty, memory, and self-confrontation before it arrived there. And if that step comes, it is rarely random. It is the result of everything silence was doing behind the scenes. Watch what happens next, because the real turning point in human connection is not always when two people are together. Sometimes it is the exact moment one of them finally understands what separation has been trying to teach them all along. And during that waiting, something else happens to you too. This part matters just as much. Silence does not only work on the one who stepped away, it works on the one who remains present with the truth. It teaches restraint. It teaches self-respect. It teaches the difference between love and chasing, between depth and desperation, between holding space and losing yourself. That is why this is not a story about forcing anyone to come back. It is a story about understanding what distance actually does. It slows things down enough for hidden feelings to surface. It removes noise. It exposes patterns. It reveals where the bond was real and where illusion was speaking louder than truth. And while the other person may be processing regret or resistance, you are also being invited into deeper clarity. You begin to see what you gave, what you tolerated, what you ignored, what you deserve. That clarity is power, because the strongest position is never panic. It is grounded presence. It is emotional steadiness. It is knowing that if a return happens, it should meet a stronger version of you, not the version that broke itself trying to be chosen. So yes, silence may awaken the other person, but it can also awaken you. It can strip away fantasy and leave only what is solid, and that changes the entire energy of the story, because when the next step finally appears, you are no longer standing in fear. You are standing in understanding, and that makes every decision that follows deeper, cleaner, and far more real. So in the end, do not be too quick to call silence a conclusion. Many times it is a process, a hidden turning point, a private battlefield where memory grows louder than excuses and emotional truth keeps rising through every layer of resistance. What looks like distance may actually be incubation. What feels like nothing may be the exact space where realization is forming. Little by little, the mask slips. The story they told themselves begins to crack. The pride that once looked strong starts feeling heavy. The emotional memory they tried to outrun keeps returning with more force. And then one day, the shift happens. Not always loudly, not always dramatically, but deeply, decisively. The mind stops fighting what the heart already knows. The connection reappears, not as fantasy, but as truth that survived absence. And from that place, the next step becomes possible. Maybe it is a return. Maybe it is an attempt to repair. Maybe it is a quiet reaching out after long silence. But whatever form it takes, it is born from inner inevitability, not surface impulse. Because distance does not always erase what is real. Sometimes it reveals it. Sometimes it purifies it. Sometimes it forces the soul of the story into full view. And if the bond carried real meaning, that meaning does not disappear just because words stopped. It waits. It works in silence. It presses against denial until denial can no longer hold. And when that weight finally tips, movement begins. That is how silence speaks. That is how truth returns. And that is how the next step is often born.